Hello, everyone. Welcome to CCIA's Federal Policy Update webinar. We hope you have been enjoying our week of webinars thus far. We started off on Monday with a legislative update with our Senior Policy Director, Amy Jenkins, and Nicole Elliott from the Governor's Office. And then yesterday we had a risk management webinar with a bunch of our friends from the Risk Management Committee focusing on insurance issues during COVID. And so both of those webinars are going to be up on our website. We hope you check them out if you weren't able to see them live. This webinar will also be up on our website, as will the two webinars that are going to be coming up on Thursday and Friday. First of all, if you're not familiar with CCIA, the California Cannabis Industry Association, we are a trade association representing businesses of all different types across California. We primarily focus on state level lobbying, but we also work with the liaison group on federal lobbying. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And that's the focus of this webinar today. So hopefully you all enjoy it. Just want to mention a couple different things. Obviously, this has been a pretty challenging time for everyone and the cannabis industry in general. And so we have been offering discounts for membership to CCIA. Currently, we're doing 20% off discounts for current members if you're up for renewal, or if you pay monthly, and new members are 20% off too, and we'll be extending that discount for another 6 weeks or so. So if you're not a CCIA member, now is a great time to engage. And you can check all of that stuff out on our website. I do want to mention that we are going to be attempting to do a little happy hour after this webinar on our GoToMeeting platform. You can register on our website and you can join us. We can have a beverage. We can introduce ourselves and try to do some social distancing, live conversations. We'll see how well that works. Come experiment with us on that. I do want to mention tomorrow at noon Pacific time, we have another webinar that is looking at business adaptation and doing some political and financial forecasting. We hope that you all will join that. We've got a number of folks from our board of directors who will be on that webinar, including Michael Wheeler from Flocana, Anna Ray Grabstein from NorCal Cannabis, Conrad Gregory from Harborside, and Michael Bonello from Poseidon Asset Management. Again, that's on our website. Check it out. You can register there. And then Friday, we're really excited to offer a 2-hour-long webinar on Friday about the state of social equity in California. And then for the second portion of that webinar, we're going to be looking specifically at the developments around social equity in Los Angeles. We know that there's been a lot happening in that region and some latest developments. So the panelists will be prepared and excited to talk with all of you about all the developments down there. So stay tuned. That one is from noon until 2 on Friday. And we have a really incredible list of speakers, including our friends at the Social Equity Owners and Workers Association will be joining to give some more context on their work in Southern California. So quite a mouthful. Anyways, let's get to the task at hand. I'm Lindsay Robinson. For those of you who don't know me, I have the honor and privilege and stress of representing the California Cannabis Industry Association every day. Thank you to all of our members who are joining us today. We obviously couldn't be here without your support, and we rep hard for y'all every day. So thanks for joining us. We have two amazing guests. If you all caught our last federal policy update just a couple months ago, again, we have Safira Galoob, who's the principal and CEO of the Liaison Group, and David Mangone, who's Director of Policy at the Liaison Group. And for those of you who don't know, the Liaison Group, as part of your membership with CCIA, you get federal representation and lobbying efforts. And so that's what we're here to talk with you all about today and do a deeper dive into new developments. We're also going to be welcoming a guest towards the end, Xander Zagzebski. I practiced his name multiple times and still didn't get it right. Anyways, hopefully when he's on, he'll forgive me. He's going to talk about the Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust investigations that are really coming to light right now, and we've had some recent developments on the federal side. So we'll be bringing that to you towards the end of the webinar. Let's kick it off. Let's get going. I'm excited to be here with both of you. This is a legal disclaimer that we have to include. means I'm surrounded by lawyers all the time. Very valuable. Please, for educational purposes only. Do either of you want to talk any more about the disclaimer?
No,
I think you covered it.
Yeah,
great
you
job,
all know.
Lindsay.
Our
Great
attendees are
job.
smart. They know what's happening. Okay, great. I am going to kick it over to Safira to start us.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you so much for hosting us and having us back. You know, I think when I think about one of the most important opportunities and responsibilities that David and I and our Chief Operating Officer Courtney has had in Washington, it's been representing the California Cannabis Industry Association. And I don't say that lightly, because if you imagine that California is, you know, arguably, sometimes I say the 5th largest economy in the world, and people correct me depending on what you're reading when, but the largest cannabis economy in the world, and the largest congressional delegation in the US Congress, with the head of the House and the Senate both being from this delegation, it is not actually an overstatement to say the importance that and weight that CCIA has carried in Washington as we're navigating federal cannabis reform. And when we started working together 2.5 years ago, I want to say that we started working together, we put together a short, mid, and long-term strategy. And the short-term strategy, just for folks that are kind of new to this, was really to introduce CCIA as an organization to the members of the California delegation. You know, if you look at how the industry has been represented in the past, and you look at kind of the groups that represent industry, it's fine that we've got national representation. That's pretty common for industries. But for nascent industries, such as the cannabis industry, that is just, you know, brand new and budding in our federal representation, it is imperative that there is a discipline, a focus, and a methodology for educating the right members of Congress at the right time about the right issues. And so the decision that the CCIA board made, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, the federal policy advisors, was that we needed pragmatic reform now. And if we tried to go too broad, too big, too bold, we were going to get nothing when we could get something imperative. And that imperative was safe banking. So we created a smaller task force that works directly with the board of directors called the Federal Policy Advisors. And it is a group of company members within CCIA who work directly with the board, who work with Lindsay and the management team and your C-suite, an amazing team you guys have. I'm so impressed with you all completely punch above your base, your punch above your belt with Josh and Justin. Just as I will tell you, and CCI members, you should know that the folks you have working for you, I can say this out loud, there's no other state association that is working with as much sophistication and as diligently on these matters as CCIA is. And we're working with a lot of folks. Oregon's wonderful, they just don't have as, and we love working with the Oregon folks as well, but CCIA, you guys have just been in it to win it every single day with us. And so what we've done with the Federal Policy Advisors is these California businesses have deepened their investment in this program, and they have deepened their time commitment. They've come to Washington with Lindsay, if not every month, every other month. We've had 6 to 8 fly-ins, and we have met with, if not every member of the California delegation, I think 85%, and many of them more than once. And by doing this, that California delegation starts to look to us, the CCIA Association, the members, your concerns as their concerns. So you start to define what's important for them in Washington as it relates to cannabis reform. And this has been, we'll talk a little bit about how this is manifested, but I just say to you that being very methodical, diligent, and most importantly, disciplined about our approach at the federal level has gotten us traction for the industry and for your association in a way that we planned, projected, and right now we are seeing the benefits and the fruits of that investment. So I hope, Lindsay, if you want to jump in on that, but hopefully that characterizes where we've been, where we are, and where we're going.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that, Safira. If folks are interested in getting more information about the Federal Policy Advisor Group, reach out to me directly. Would be happy to chat with you about it. It's a very high level little task force that we've assembled, and we've been able to make some real strides and lay the foundation for the work that we're doing currently. So thank you for that.
I think, David, you're going to start with kind of where we are post-COVID the COVID packages and some of the efforts that we've been successful with over the past 6 weeks. So I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Lindsay, for having us. Always appreciate chatting with you on this type of platform. But yeah, I wish we could say that we were post-COVID in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately, we are still very much in the middle of a lockdown. Things are starting to open back up. You're seeing some press allowed back on the Hill, but in terms of external lobbyists and meetings, they're still being very tightly restrictive in terms of who they let into the Capitol complex. So for Safira and I, it has been an ongoing challenge, of course, doing our engagement and our lobbying activities through Zoom, through phone calls, but it really highlights the importance of the relationships that we have built over the last several years with staff and members, being able to get them on calls, on Zooms, and not just necessarily walking into their office to prioritize the issues that we want them to care about. So since March, there have been 3 COVID relief packages that have passed out of both chambers. So unfortunately, these packages created some additional hindrances to cannabis businesses without providing much benefit. The first is the requirement of paid sick leave. In these COVID packages, there was a requirement for employers with over 50 employees to pay for sick leave of up to 2 weeks for their employees. Despite the federal government continuing to classify cannabis as a Schedule I substance and classify cannabis businesses as illegal, that didn't absolve these businesses from meeting this requirement and having to comply with this requirement. The flip side of that, of course, is with the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as the disaster loan funding, cannabis businesses weren't eligible. There was some guidance from the Small Business Administration that said some ancillary businesses may qualify, but it was discretionary to the Small Business Administration. And because so many cannabis businesses and ancillary businesses were deemed essential, not just in California, but across the country, it became very challenging for these businesses to prove the appropriate loss of income over the specified time period by the SBA. So we have seen a few cannabis-related companies get some SBA loans through SEC filings. Whether or not those businesses are able to keep that funding is currently either in litigation or in rulemaking. One notable example is Mass Roots, which is a media company that gets most of their cannabis dollars, obviously from the industry, but they aren't directly plant touching themselves, but there is a very clear nexus between their clients and the revenue they earn. And if you interpret the guidance literally, the guidance literally says any revenue derived from the cannabis industry would disqualify you. So the fact that they were able to qualify for a loan, it's certainly interesting under the guidance that was issued, but they are certainly the exception, not the norm. I know Safira will get a little bit more into the HEROES Act, but the first 3 packages passed relatively quickly. And having spent a number of years in Washington, it's been really the quickest succession of bills passed in both chambers. All 3 packages were passed in less than a month. That's kind of unheard of in Congress unless there is a looming deadline of a funding bill or the defense authorization bill, but usually that's only one package at a time. To have 3 separate packages totaling over $2 trillion is really sort of a new way for us to legislate. There's typically not these large packages that have big price tags on them that move through the halls of Congress. It's not something that we've seen in a while. Typically, these larger packages, history tells us the Affordable Care Act, President Trump's tax reform package, those took weeks and weeks of preparation and debate and markups and hearings, and that was not the case with these COVID packages. So things moved very quickly, which for the first 3 packages, I think was to the cannabis industry's disadvantage. There was very few people at the negotiating tables in terms of what these packages look like. But now where we are in package 4, the HEROES Act, there's been a little bit more time to take a step back and assess where the priorities are for members and for where the priorities are for the different parties. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Safira after I talk about, I forgot what's in my own slides. After I talk about a really important effort that CCIA coalesced earlier this spring. So in May, we worked with Representatives Porter, Liu, and Correa to lead a letter on behalf of the California delegation to Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to include safe banking language into their HEROES Act, which is the House Phase 4 relief package. Over the course of about 8 days, we were able to get 14 members of the California delegation on board, which is by no means insignificant. Having over a quarter of the delegation in terms of Democrats sign on a letter to Speaker Pelosi and having behind the scenes support from the likes of Representative Maxine Waters, as well as Representative Zoe Lofgren, who is the dean of the California delegation, having their staff support as well as those 14 members really made a tremendous impact on the inclusion of safe language in the HEROES Act. So now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Safira to talk about what we're doing. But first, Lindsay, please, I know your members worked really hard to make this happen. So if you'd like to say a few more words about that, that'd be great.
I do. Well, I think it's really meaningful when there's opportunities for members to engage directly. This was a prime example of an opportunity that sprung up that we were able to talk with our members about in key districts around the state, where they were able to put pressure on their representatives to sign on to the Porter Lou Correa letter. And when I say Lou, I mean the other individual, not Mr. Lou Correa. Anywho, so that opportunity I think is really meaningful, and we did see an impact, and I think it made a difference in the voice that was being heard, the united voice that was being heard from California businesses to Speaker Pelosi. So thank you to all of those people who answered our emails, got your letters together, took my phone calls late in the day. It was a good undertaking, I think, and it shows that collectively that putting the pressure on is really important in issues like this. So thank you to everyone. I did also want to let people know that if you have questions, you can use the module on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get to them later on in the presentation. But if folks have any, please submit them. Okay, back to you, Safira.
Great. So, David mentioned this Dear Colleague letter, and Lindsay thanked you for it. I'm gonna back out and tell you what it meant and where it was in the political process. So those of you who are kind of attending towards these packages, the most important thing about these packages is they constitute a concept called a legislative vehicle. So if you think about your early days in civics, I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, it is a complete misnomer that a bill actually goes through the introduction into the committee, out of committee, into the House floor, passes, and then the same process happens to the Senate. This concept of a standalone bill happens with very, very large constructs like healthcare, but it would never happen with cannabis. Yes, we were able to get through the House last September, but it was a very unique circumstance, and it was only because we had 2/3 votes to be able to do it. But in this climate, and frankly going forward, we've never expected any piece of legislation for cannabis to be standalone. It needs another bill to ride onto, and we call that a legislative vehicle. And the reason David brought a light to these vehicles is that if you imagine that there's a train leaving the station, we want cannabis reform to be on it. And when the COVID-4 package, the HEROES Act as it's called, out of the House was being contemplated and drafted, our objective was to get into that bill. And yes, it was a broad bill and it was a big bill, but it was no guarantee we were going to get in. And it really, I was pretty hopeful, but we weren't sure. And I want to let you know, we had a meeting after it was introduced, after HEROES is introduced with Safe Banking Act. I was on a webinar in conjunction with our very wonderful champion, Ed Perlmutter, who, by the way, is arguably the most important person for cannabis banking that you will ever hear. He's so diligent He is so determined. He perseveres so much. So I just want to let you know, he's our guy. We were on a webinar together, and it was a day after it passed, and he said in front of God and everybody, he said, I know that we were successful because of your work activating California. And I said, he knows. He knows how important CCIA is. He knows how important this effort was. And it means that but for California activating and us organizing, we may not be where we are. And we're going to need continued activation, organizing with even more focus for the next go around. So I just want to say that it was not nothing that we got into the HEROES Act. I do want to go ahead and let's go next slide, David. I do want to talk a little bit about kind of where we are for the HEROES Act. So as you can imagine, and as you've heard, the concept of the HEROES Act is dead on arrival in the Senate. Well, is it the case that, again, going back to your civics class, that the HEROES Act is going to be taken up by the Senate and said, oh, we like this part, we don't like this? No, that's not the way it's going to work. What will happen is, and what we're expecting to happen, is on the Senate side, Senator McConnell and likely either the White House or Treasury Secretary Mnuchin will draft their own version of a COVID package. And it may include nothing that's in the HEROES Act. It may or may not. I'm not privy to those conversations. We're not expecting safe banking to be included on the Senate side. What we are expecting is that there'll be things that Leader McConnell wants to include, such as business liability protections, so that when people come back to work, businesses don't have the liability exposure. And we're expecting the White House to want and demand payroll tax deductions. And they're going to need Speaker Pelosi's help and her cooperation for those priorities. And so our job as advocates for the industry and on behalf of the California Cannabis Industry Association is to ensure that we signal to Leader Pelosi that cannabis banking must be a priority that survives the negotiation. And we have a little saying that David will go to is let it live. But this will happen at I don't say the 11th hour, but it will absolutely be in conference. And we will not know until we know. And we will have to work closely with Senate Chairman Mike Crapo in terms of his concerns in advancing language that he may be interested in. So we'll have to negotiate. We'll have to be working with the White House, which we are doing real time. We'll have to be working with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, which we are doing real time. And we are on a full-on effort between now and the next 30 days to work towards ensuring that safe banking survives and is a part of the COVID package. It is not a guarantee. We are climbing up Mount Everest, but because we have the vehicle, because we have the political tailwinds and the policy that is tight and focused, and we have the strategy, the methodology, and the discipline, we have our best chance that we've ever had, and we will have our best chance that we'll have for the foreseeable future. David or Lindsay, are there anything that you want to add to that? I see Sander, welcome. I see you joined the panel. I know you were introduced earlier, so welcome, Sander. And I know we're going to be turning to you later, but I just wanted to welcome you.
Thank you so much.
David, Lindsay, anything else?
David, do you want to add any pieces there?
Before I transition to a letter, I don't have anything to add on the overall strategy, but it is an important thing to remember that we are still, despite all this, in an election year. And that is going to make a significant determination in terms of what policies are put forward, how the caucus as a whole, both Democratic and Republican, is going to behave on non-controversial issues, but certainly that will be amplified with controversial issues as well. You may see a lot of posturing by both sides, Democrats and Republicans, in advance of their party conventions in August, in terms of setting what their party platform is. So you may very well see the introduction of legislation or floor speeches that realistically don't have a chance of getting through the Senate or don't have a chance of getting the support in the House. But members are thinking about the races that they are in. They're thinking about the races that their colleagues are in, particularly those seats that are in purple districts, especially in the Senate. And they are thinking about how this calculus helps maintain their majority or take it away from the other party. So, you know, it is challenging enough to pass something like safe banking in a non-election year. You add in those additional politics and personalities as we lead up to November, it can only be certain to complicate things. So beyond that, I don't think I have anything to add in terms of where we are, but what a year.
Lindsay, anything else?
Nope, that's
So
it.
let's go to the next slide and talk about what we've been doing over the last few weeks. And I'm actually going to have David talk about this, because the other climate in which we are operating is this very difficult and heart-wrenching civil unrest. And that adds an entire layer of consideration as we navigate Washington, both from a political perspective, but also from the important humanities, the humanity of it perspective. And on behalf of the cannabis industry, we have been very careful and thoughtful about how we have done that. David, do you want to talk a little bit about what activities we took almost immediately after the horrors you experienced in California?
Yeah, and there's two narratives right now, and there's one, the critically important social and racial justice. What you've seen from protests around the country demanding police reform, accountability of government officials, and of course working to end systematic racism. The other, I think, unfortunate aspect that has been lumped in with a lot of these very positive narrations has been this string of organized crime that many of you in California have experienced. Unfortunately, because of opportunists looking to use this movement for their own gain, you saw lots of targeted break-ins, robberies, and lootings of some of your dispensaries and facilities in conjunction, but not because of the social activities that were going in terms of the protests for Black Lives Matter. So, striking that balance, we sent a letter to congressional leadership informing them of the strings of robberies, but at the same time supporting the spirit of the movement that's calling for social and racial justice. So that was sent on June 15th to leadership. It's going to be circulated to everyone in the delegation. We're in the process of getting that accomplished this week and last week. But it's a constant reminder that the issues that we work on, like safe banking, are bigger than just that issue. But that being said, we can't necessarily lose sight of the progress we've made on the issue of safe banking, but are having open conversations with members and with members within CCIA of how we shape the narrative and how we shape our response to things that have been going on. So, Safira, any other thoughts on that letter?
No, I think you covered it quite thoroughly. We are aware that there are certain congressional districts where some additional coalition of information and directed communications are necessary in Congresswoman Lee's district, in Congressman Swalwell's district, and aspects of Ms. Pelosi's district, Ms. Matsui's district. So the districts in Los Angeles, and you should expect that we'll be reaching out to you to, one, make sure we are aware of the activities that many of you have undergone, and to basically thread you together so we can collectively speak with one powerful voice, so that Ms. Lee knows that if it wasn't urgent before, our urgency is even more intense now. So I think it's important. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the police reform bills, which you may have heard. But with regard to safe banking, I know that, Lindsay, I don't think we have any questions in queue, but based on some of the conversations you've had with the board or other members, are there any other questions that you think members on this call or prospective members may be interested in that we didn't cover with regard to safe banking and our efforts over the next 30 days?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've been hearing quite a bit from our members is opportunities to engage and be involved and be helpful. Kind of threading all of these narratives together for a unified perspective from California. Obviously, we represent many different types of businesses. It's always been something that we strive to do, but has always provided a unique challenge as well. And so I think creating opportunities for our members to engage, to send letters, to contact their delegates, I think is always helpful. And certainly being incredibly mindful of the areas that we saw targeted by organized crime, specifically on the cannabis industry, oftentimes because of the level of cash that could be on hand at these locations. I think it's really helpful for our delegates to understand the complexities of that and how that's woven into a broader narrative around safe banking. We want to provide opportunities within the California legal market for businesses to thrive, for social equity businesses to thrive, for barriers to be lowered so that folks who might not be participating on the legal side of the industry have an opportunity to cross over. And so it's a very difficult thing to patch together on occasion, but CCIA very much strives for a balance there. Obviously, you all know that we work extensively on tax reform, on creating viable environments for these businesses to thrive, but so much of that also has to be woven into these broader social equity conversations and social justice conversations, and that has never been more evident than it is now. And I think a lot of this also supports a greater need, for us to be listening to our partners across the state, across the country, and be able to thoughtfully advocate for safe banking, to be able to elevate these businesses and be able to create more of a level playing field. And so a lot of what we're doing now is listening and talking with our members. Our board have been doing a lot of outreach, particularly to the businesses that we are in contact with that have been through these robberies and how they're dealing with it and how their staff is dealing with it. The employee aspect of it has been difficult. So, just being mindful of all of this stuff and hopefully being a space where people can come and talk and dialogue about these issues. That's what we've been really focusing on for the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to do so.
And Lindsay, before we pass it to David to talk about the police reform, because that's going to have a little bit more of a dynamic, broader perspective, I want folks on the call, and particularly you have such a rich and informed subject matter experts on diversity, inclusion, social corporate responsibility, all of the pieces that are crucial for us to have the industry that we want. Right now, I want to share with stakeholders, CCIA members and California industry stakeholders, that the most challenging element of the past 3 days for us has been to maintain a discipline towards advancing safe banking when we want to do so much more. So there's a tension to say, okay, this is the time, go big. But really, this is when, frankly, our value is most important, because we have a desire for our own sensibility to say, forget banking, let's go for everything. We need everything, this is the time. But the truth of this is there's a reality on the ground in DC. We have a very limited amount of time to do it. And so if we weren't disciplined, we lose this window, and we're not doing right by the industry that demands and deserves our focus and our attention. So I just want to let folks know, because we have gotten some feedback on why are we just so safe banking, when there's this issue around humanity that needs to be addressed. And so I just thought it would be worthwhile for folks to hear from us that we're not tone deaf towards it, but we are doing everything we can to stay disciplined towards what we need to accomplish in the next 30 days. David, do you want to talk about the police reform bill?
Yeah, before I do, I just wanted to add that I think Lindsay really hit it on the head. Safe banking is a reform. It's not the reform. By no means will it fix the years and years and years of inequitable policing, of inequitable incarceration. But I did want to raise a point for the folks on the call. When you look at access to capital, there were 200 individuals who were either Black or Latinx in 2018. 200 total, not in the cannabis industry, total nationwide, who are able to raise over $1 million in venture capital. So when you look at those numbers and you look at the median household wealth For white entrepreneurs, it's around 171,000. For Black, it's around 23,000. So just the unequal playing field in terms of where capital exists. As many of you know, starting a cannabis business is expensive. You often have to rely on personal savings, investments from friends. So if you are someone who doesn't have access to that wealth, safe banking doesn't fix all those issues, but it starts opening that door. So on that, I will transition into the policing bills. That has been the center of attention on Capitol Hill, particularly on the Senate side. Today, the Senate bill that was originally proposed by Tim Scott did not move forward. Rightly so. A lot of senators raised objections to what was left out. Cannabis wasn't ever in the draft, but it was certainly raised by several senators, including Senator Sanders last Friday, and it has been continually raised by Senator Booker, occasionally by Senator Harris, because there's a very clear nexus, as you all know, between cannabis reform and policing reform. On the House side, there have been very, very quiet rumblings that there may be an amendment introduced related to cannabis. There's not necessarily widespread support for that yet, or widespread notoriety, frankly. But it's also entirely possible that, like I said earlier, as Democrats are looking to shape their party platform going into November with Joe Biden as their candidate, that they look to flesh out their drug policy more so as a party, and may take some bills that are coming up in the next couple of months to take that opportunity to do so.
So I think with that, that really encompasses what's happening in DC. And I don't want to spend more time to get us, post end of July and into the August recess. I also want to, before we transition into Sandra's piece, I do want to offer, Lindsay, for folks who are curious, even though we have people here who are not, CCIA members yet, I really want us to be a resource for people, because I know that CCIA's primary job is to keep its eye on state ball, and it should be. But there's an opportunity here, as I think we've described. But if folks don't understand that and they're still curious, I just want us to be able to make ourselves available for your prospects or California industry stakeholders, so that you feel like you have access to information on the ground, and that you have CCIA as your resource to connect to that resource. So we're in it for the long run, and whether you're a member now or you're not, we're still here for you. I want to share that earlier today, when Lindsay and David and I were preparing for this call, I said we have to bring on a special guest today. And I want to say that yesterday I was in the middle of a fundraiser with 3 Republican senators, and I received a text from a reporter who'd gotten an embargoed testimony that no one was expecting. Sandra's going to go through it, but essentially there was a whistleblower testimony filed that was actually reported today from the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. And it was a surprise to all of us. It is not a surprise as to what they reported, but it coming out and the timing was a surprise. The testimony happened today, and I said, this is what real-time reporting looks like. David and I are not the subject matter experts on this, but I know just who to call. And so Sandra was very gracious to, I'm sure, move your calendar around with all the other things you have going on today. He's been following this issue very, very closely for the past 18, 24 months since it's all started. And he has agreed to kind of walk us through what happened, why it's happened. We're going to work with it a brief amount of time and then possibly do something in the future. But Lindsay, if it's okay, I will pass it to Sandra to educate us on what happened on the Hill today with this testimony. Sandra?
Okay, I guess I'm up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Safira and Lindsay and Dave. Nice to see you again. Just briefly, I'm Sandra Zegzebski. I run the West Coast corporate practice for Greenspoon Mortar. We, as you probably know, are pretty invested in the cannabis space. A little bit of background might set the stage more deliciously for you for this, this testimony. In larger mergers and acquisitions transactions, larger being as you approach 100 million, really about $94 million, you might have to make what's called a Hart-Scott-Rodino filing with the antitrust regulators. It's a relatively boring thing, doesn't get a lot of press, but you might say, well, why does that matter to the cannabis industry? We're not even federally legal. Well, the reality is there's no exception for cannabis companies. It's a roughly $43,000 a day penalty if you don't make the filing. So back in late 2018 and early 2019, when larger cannabis M&A deals started to be announced, M&A lawyers like myself started talking to one another and say, hey, I think we're going to be in the weird position of making Hart-Scott-Rodino filings to the federal antitrust regulators, even though we're not a federally legal business. And we did so in several transactions. Why does this matter? And I apologize for the boring stuff. It gets more interesting in a minute. It matters because when you make the filing, it's usually a non-event. You make the filing, 30 days later, you can close your transaction, and nobody thinks about it. The purpose of making the filing is so the antitrust regulators can examine the transaction and decide whether it has some negative effect on competition. Antitrust laws, after all, are consumer protection laws. So in other words, in theory, the antitrust lawyers would say, is the merger of company A with company B going to adversely impact the price of weed in Sonoma County? And back in 2019, that would have been a rather, at least in our minds, an absurd thing for the antitrust regulators to think about. So we didn't really give it much more than a passing thought until every single cannabis HSR filing became subject to what's called a second request. The second request process is a very deep dive examination by the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Rather than get into all the details, order of magnitude, it delays deals 8, 9, 10 months on average, and costs about $1 million in terms of fees to comply with the request. So all of these things happened back in late Q1, early Q2 of last year. We obviously were involved in these deals, so we got notice of it. We started talking to other people who had heard about it. I, of course, called Safira, and we realized that all of the cannabis transactions that made a filing, other than the MPX Iantis deal, which got through during the government shutdown, every one of these filings was reviewed, and it was a little bit unclear as to why. Rather than get into the details of it, we now have a little bit of background as to why these deals got reviewed. Last night, a career Justice Department official, John Elias, who works in the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, released his written testimony, which he gave today before the Judiciary Committee. And in that testimony, he alleges that the Antitrust Division's review of cannabis companies was not motivated by a bona fide desire to examine the competitive impact of these cannabis transactions, but rather was motivated by political animus on the part of the Attorney General. And so why is that significant? Well, other folks in this call can probably talk about the political significance of it. It is an election year, obviously, and the oral testimony, I understand from in front of the Judiciary Committee, sort of leaned in favor of the political aspects of it, or the political ramifications of this testimony. But for the industry itself, it is on the one hand unsurprising, but on the other hand somewhat disappointing. When these reviews first came out, our initial reaction, although it was troubling to see all the cannabis companies that were doing large transactions suddenly finding themselves subject to an unjustified antitrust review by federal regulators, we also took some degree of comfort in the fact that the antitrust regulators were treating us like adults. So in other words, it was perversely good news for the cannabis industry to have the antitrust regulators reviewing cannabis transactions, because it meant that they were actually treating us like we were a real business and a real industry, as opposed to, you know, this illegal industry that they like to ignore when it comes to everything other than collecting taxes. So it was disappointing, I think, to learn that if, assuming this testimony is true and is accurately reflecting what was happening in the Justice Department, it's disappointing to learn that maybe there's more ground that the industry needs to cover with at least some members of this administration than we may have previously thought. So, you know, that's the testimony is clear, has clearly been presented as significant, and it certainly is significant in the sense that if you review it, a number of these transactions, even though they were large transactions, according to Mr. Elias, the Justice Department official giving the testimony, these deals did not trigger any legitimate antitrust concerns. And so he's really saying that this was presented as a way of getting back at the cannabis industry or causing the cannabis industry some difficulty. And a lot of these are transactions you've heard about. The testimony specifically talks about the MedMen PharmaCann transaction, and you probably know that transaction was delayed as a result of this antitrust review and ultimately did not close. It doesn't mention the other 9. There were 10 cannabis deals that were reviewed, but they will all be the deals you've heard of, because they'll be the big deals. So it would be, you know, Cresco Origin House, it would be Harvest Verano, it would be Curaleaf Select. It's that type of transaction. Really the top 10 transactions in cannabis. And as you probably know from reading the press, a number of those transactions didn't close at all, and the ones that did manage to close were amended and had to essentially be repriced, because certainly in the interim, the capital markets changed, valuations changed, a lot of circumstances changed. So unclear what the Attorney General's primary motivation was, because in my mind, if the Attorney General, you know, really wanted to make life difficult for the cannabis industry, he really wouldn't need to look to the antitrust regulators to do that, right? The DEA and FBI are certainly happy to take his call, and they can enforce the Controlled Substances Act directly. So it's a little strange that he would seek to call into question the integrity of the antitrust review process in order to make life difficult for cannabis companies. But that is the allegation in reading the testimony. So it's been in the press. It broke last night. The Saphira had it hot off the presses, and there's been a lot of activity, and I expect a lot more published quotes from the oral testimony given today. Well, you'll probably be reading about that online or in the paper tomorrow.
And I'd say that I don't know how this is going to end. Well, I think it's too early to tell to see what impact this may or may not have on the safe banking, our activities on safe banking. I think they're separate, but I never presume the politics are separate. I think, frankly, everything just happened this afternoon. I know as late as like an hour before this call, the Justice Department actually issued a statement, obviously denying or expectingly they denied these allegations. And so I think we are in a world of assessing through the IG. I think what could be interesting, and this is what a reporter shared with me when she was asking me about my thoughts on it, which I agree with Sandra, that, you know, I shared that this is de facto legitimizes our industry, and if they really wanted to give us a hard time, he would have walked up the street when I say called on the black helicopters, and he didn't do that. So on some levels, this demonstrates that justice is treating us like other industries in the world. I'd say that in terms of, you know, will industry be called by the IG, the Inspector General, to investigate these allegations, that remains to be seen, but I don't think we should be surprised about that.
Well, and let me add something, Safira, is when these things started happening, again, we were rather shocked, right? Because the idea that antitrust regulators would be concerning themselves with protecting cannabis consumers was almost laughable, a year and a half ago. And so in fact, I think the first time I brought up antitrust enforcement in a cannabis deal, the people on the call laughed at it. So it really was sort of a punchline. But when these things started happening and the industry started talking to the Justice Department, the word that came back to us was, hey, look, we in the Justice Department, Antitrust Division, are reading about these increasingly large M&A transactions happening in the industry. We're watching this industry consolidate, and we're not paying any attention to it, and we don't have any information about it, and we don't want the winners and losers in cannabis to be dictated on our watch when we're not actually paying attention. So setting aside the Controlled Substances Act, we want to pay attention. And if our only tool is a hammer, you're all a bunch of nails. Sorry, you're going to have to respond to second requests, incur an 8, 9, 10 month delay in your deals, and $1 million each in legal fees, roughly. And so that was the explanation that was presented to us. I would like to think that at least among some folks in the antitrust division at the DOJ, that does in fact accurately express how they feel about us. And I would also, I think at the time, I would observe that, again, the administration, forget about the politics itself, but as far if we wanted to think about an administration that would be unfriendly to cannabis, we could have done a lot worse even than the current administration, right? So back then when we were getting this feedback, we were hopeful. I'd still like to be semi-hopeful, but it was obviously disappointing to get this testimony and to hear that, gee, maybe this was somebody was messing with us, for lack of a better word, rather than doing a bona fide regulatory review of these deals.
Well, there's going to be a lot of M&A activity over the coming
Certainly.
months, which is outside of my expertise and David's expertise. You're the one who papers those deals. And so
Yes.
like everything else that happens in Washington, everything that we see is a data point and should inform our decisions and the way that we think strategically about an industry and the future of this economy. So Lindsay, I don't know if there are any questions, but I want to be mindful of time. And
Yep. Yeah, we're getting close to time, but yeah, I very much appreciate you, Xander, hopping on last minute.
We're big supporters of CCIA, right?
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate that, and we try to be as relevant and as efficient as we can with information that we're presenting to our members, and this was super timely. So I think we have 30 days or so. There's going to be an extremely hard push for banking within California. We're going to be pulling all the levers and using every bit of leverage we have in order to keep banking in and to keep it on Pelosi's radar. So I would expect, though, we brought an update to you all about 2 months ago. I would imagine in another month we will probably do this again and have more news to share. Obviously, the landscape is evolving quickly. And I would actually really like to explore maybe doing something with a little bit more time as seeing as how things develop with Xander, just to keep an eye on these investigations. I think obviously there's always a lot of balls in the air with cannabis. I do appreciate your words about having a little hope. I think you can't really be in this space if you don't have hope and don't believe that we can achieve something bigger and brighter and better.
Sure.
I know it's been 2020 has been a challenging year on many levels, but I see more coalition building. I see stronger voices. I see opportunities for us to work together and really have more common goals. So I'm excited about that. And I'm super grateful for all of you hopping on the webinar today and for all of your diligence and work. To our members, stay tuned. We might be calling you or writing to you to activate around some banking issues. We do want to provide opportunities for our members to get involved. We know it's important. And yeah, you know where to find all of us. This webinar will be up on our website if you want to rewatch it, because it's good stuff, I would say. Any final words, folks, before we sign off?
We have an hour to be happy together. Isn't there a happy hour somewhere?
We have a happy hour, and if you haven't signed up yet, you have to register separately, because we're actually going to go to our GoToMeeting platform so we can see people and talk to people, not just look at each other. Have a glass of wine, bring some cannabis, whatever floats your boat. And that's going to start in just a few minutes. And then we'll let people know if we're going to have a follow-up conversation on the current investigations going on with the antitrust stuff, which is super
Certainly.
fascinating. And I have a lot to catch up on that. So thank you, Sander, and thank you, David. And yeah, we'll circle back soon. And if you haven't signed up for the other CCIA webinars, go to our website. Again, we've got one tomorrow on business adaptation and some financial forecasting, and then 2 hours of social equity on Friday, which we're really excited about. So hopefully folks will join in the conversation, and we'll see you all real soon.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Excellent. Thank you, Lindsay. David, good to see you. Bye, Sapira.
Take care.